you. Always. Um, okay, Arlene, Dale, thank you for coming. Good to see you.
See you.
How do you want to proceed? I mean, I'm happy to talk about this stuff because even if there isn't anybody here, it's been several months since I was last at any sort of convention, and it's good to get back into the rhythm of being on a panel. Um, but I'm also of the mind that, well, this should be like high school. If nobody shows up after 10 or 15 minutes, we should just call it a class. I'm open to either position.
Well, speaking as a former high school teacher, I'm fine with that.
Okay.
I'll do whatever. I mean, if you guys want to sit and talk for an hour, I'm fine with that.
I'm totally
if
fine.
you're lonely, I'll sit here and talk. No. But yeah, I got the next hour free. I mean, if you got somewhere better to go, I understand that. But yeah, whatever you want to do.
No, I'm fine. I'm free for the hour.
Yeah.
I'm just good with whatever you decide. So.
Well, while we're here, while we're here, Arlene, welcome to SF Canada. You just joined recently, didn't you?
Yes. Yes, I come late to the table.
It's a good group of people. I think you're going to enjoy being there.
Well, I see advantages in being a member, and and I plan to be involved. I don't like joining an organization just to have it on my resume. I like to participate and take advantage of activities that are available and
Mhm.
give back something.
No point otherwise. Yeah, fair enough. Shall we do some introductions? Just apprise each other of what we do.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Shall I
This
start?
is right after I got my little thing blurb.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
Okay.
I didn't start till I was 65, so there you go.
Well, I've been writing since junior high.
I've been writing since the age of 6.
Okay.
We can do this all night, guy.
I've only been writing since the age of 8, so.
I'm not counting my very, very young poetry phase.
And it's also true that I only finished the first draft of my first novel at the age of 50. I was writing short stories and other things before that, but didn't become a serious writer until kind of later in life. Okay, Dale, you write hard science fiction. Arlene?
I write the story that demands to be written. And sometimes that's science fiction, sometimes it's fantasy. A couple of the short stories in my collection are horror. And my next book coming out in November is a murder mystery.
Oh, nice.
So, but there are paranormal elements to it. So it actually qualifies as speculative fiction, but basically it's a murder mystery.
As I often tell people, before I was a science fiction geek, I was a mystery geek, and I really appreciate a good mystery story.
I'm a puzzle solver. I am, give me a Sudoku or a Kakuro or a logic problem, I'm fine. Yeah. I'll stay hydrated and I'll stay there and I'll solve it until it's done. That's it.
Yeah. My web goddess finally got me onto Wordle, so I do that every day now, among other puzzles and things. Although what I will say is that I'm absolutely horrible at figuring out solving mysteries while I'm in the middle of a novel. I have a very bad track record of doing that, which I think is kind of fine. I mean, I guess there's some satisfaction in knowing, but there's also I find much more satisfaction in being surprised, right? That's part of the part of the pleasure of mystery novels is finding out the solution at the end and then going back and seeing all the clues. And it's like, oh yeah, I should have gotten that, but
Yeah.
just didn't. So why? Well, why are you so eclectic?
Oh, who are you talking to?
Are you talking to Dale
Oh,
or me?
Arlene.
Okay. I guess I was just born hardwired for storytelling, and I see stories everywhere. And you know, every once in a while, one hops off the back burners and taps me on the shoulder and says, "You're going to write me, or I'm going to not give you any peace for the, you know, for the rest of your life. You got to write me." And so I will do that. My first novel was a romantic suspense for Harlequin Books. My second was a fantasy. I've been doing this for decades.
But so you're not beholden to a specific genre, right? It's what the story demands.
It's what the story demands. Like I've even written children's stories.
Nice.
You know, it's whatever occurs to me, and
Mm-hmm.
a lot of it is the characters.
Okay, Dale.
She's a true writer, what I call a true writer, in that she's just the conduit. And writers understand that. You know, something comes out, maybe it's a song lyric, it's a poem, it's a short story, it's a novel, it's a whatever, a greeting card, you know, or a joke or something. Whatever that happens to be, it kind of tells you why you're writing it. And so that's what you put out. I mean, to be 4 books are hard science fiction. Doesn't mean it's the only thing I've written, though they're all kind of been in the science fiction kind of broad umbrella. And I've written like 5 little mid-reader books for my granddaughter, so which have not gone anywhere, except she has read them and keeps bugging me, why haven't they been published yet? But that's just the advantage of having a built-in fan club, I guess. But yeah, I agree. You got to get those ideas out of your head, or they just rattle around in there.
The worst thing, you know, before I get to this point, JD, are you a panelist or a guest?
I'm a panelist whose power just came back on after being off all day, and I'm trying to get the camera working. So bear with me and I will join you shortly.
Okay, well, no, you're here. In spirit, if not in actual physical presence. And now, of course, I've completely forgotten what I was going to say. We've done some introductions. JD, why don't you introduce yourself to...
I will, but I think, oh, hang on. I think I should like to get, oh.
There you are. Okay.
There I am. Right. Okay. Hi. Hi. I'm JD DeLuzio, and I apologize to anyone who wanted to attend my reading that didn't happen earlier. 15 minutes before my reading, the power went out with a storm, and it literally just came on 5 minutes ago, and then of course we had to wait for the internet to become accessible. There was a major electrical Great Lakes Basin type storm in this region. Anyway, I'm JD DeLuzio, author of, most recently, Keycon and Live Nude Aliens and Other Stories, and with a couple of other projects in progress right now that maybe will come up later that may be relevant. And gosh, I hope there's somebody in listening besides us.
Well, we have a room.
We have a room, and my experience with the room is that there were usually 2 or 3 people in the room.
Okay.
I'll go do it. There's 7 of us.
Yay!
All right, great. Okay.
And, so I'm glad to be able to join something today. Don't even ask about today. Okay. I can only say with all the sirens, some people are having a lot worse day than I have. And there was major power lines down all across the city. So, all right, let's talk about aliens, but somebody else probably still has to introduce themselves.
Okay, well, we've gone through the introductions. There are brief bios of at least a couple of us in the chat area if you want to learn more about who we are. My rule of thumb is that when there are more guests than there are panelists, it's a panel, so we can get started now, I think. I'm just going to go around the room and ask if there are any preliminary comments or observations about world building. I will also say that the way I run panels is that we usually talk for a half an hour, 35 minutes. And then if there are any questions, I will open it up to the people in the boardroom. Let's go around. Let's start with Arlene. Do you have any opening comments?
Yeah. I always start my workshops on this topic by pointing out that every time you write a story, you're creating a brand new world. And although it may look the same as the real world, it's not, because your fictional characters and events and settings are in it and not in the real world. And that the reader will gladly suspend disbelief about that as long as you make it realistic. If you can give your setting, your world, the illusion of reality, it's like a bargain that you're keeping with the reader that says, yeah.
I think that's actually, sorry, a really good cautionary point for people. Just because you're setting it in modern day, wherever you happen to live, doesn't mean that you can just take for granted that the reader will have all of the same cultural and local touchstones that you do. You still have to build that world as if it was a fictional world, because it is, right? Really good point. Dale, do you have any, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. Did you?
That's okay.
Okay. Dale, do you want to open it up with anything?
Sure. Being trained as an engineer, I'm one of those people that would love to sit down and make geographic maps and also, design everything. But what you can do, I mean, you can make your own, as authors, for your own language and the whole custom system, political system, etc. But you don't have to. There is so much out there, geographic regions that are interesting, past, present, or maybe what they look like future. Custom, and even names. I go out to Wikipedia and just randomly search sites and look for interesting names, for whatever reason, and then use them. But you don't have to put also all of that into your story. You probably will have more than you put in your story. But if you put in just at least a few references to different things, it really adds to the character of the story. You don't have to tell them what modern fashion is, but you might comment on one or two pieces or something. Or especially if you're reading something with a humorous tint, you have all sorts of possibilities to put weird, funny things in your world, that people, don't use money. They use layers of clothing or, some weird thing that just somehow integrates into your story and just makes it unique and interesting. So I'd say anybody who's trying to do that, don't think you have to start medieval Europe or you have to design the whole thing. Just borrow and be a little creative.
That's what I've done a couple of panels on research, and what we always say is research are subject to death, but use very little of it in the actual story. Only what you need to build a credible world, for sure. JD, opening thoughts?
Yeah, I think a lot of what's been said has been really good. The Turkey City Lexicon, which I recommend as a loose guideline to anybody who's writing science fiction or fantasy, has two really useful concepts here. One is the idea of the edges of ideas. People do not see your whole world, and there's nothing worse than, hi, I'm now going to front load the entire history of this world, and it's at the beginning of this story, try not to fall asleep. But you have to, as you say, you have to know the world, so that where things come up, you either already know how that functions in that world, or you can figure out based on what you know how it probably will function. I mean, one of the ones I'm going to talk about from a recent published novella is an alternate history world. And that gets really interesting because you have to think of the sheer number of things that will be changed. And all too often, I think even really good writers just say, aha, everything's exactly the same except for the stuff and that may or may not will work for the reader. The other Turkey Pseudo Lexicon idea has already been referenced by Dale a moment ago, their tongue-in-cheek reference to I've suffered for my art, so now it's your turn, where everything the writer has obsessively researched now must appear in the story. And I also teach a creative writing class. It's like, no, it doesn't need to appear in the story. Glad that you found out that detail. Maybe in a future story set in this world, it will need to be relevant, but it's not relevant here, so stop mentioning it. It's a side note. And I can tell you, even with the con, which is ostensibly set in our world, there are pages of notes to make sure everything is consistent and such that were necessary to write something that's literally set in a hotel in Toronto. Mainly, it goes elsewhere, including outer space. The other thing is, often when I write about aliens, almost consistently, we're not on the alien world, but you get glimpses of it. You get implications of what it might be like. And that, I think, is relevant where we need to see it. But the whole history and so forth, and I do have some stories certainly set on alien worlds, but you kind of gesture to the edges of ideas, the stuff that touches your story. And the rest is if someone wants to ask you about it at a con or something, you can tell them about it.
Yeah, that's the perfect place to unload your research on people who really want to know it. JD, could you mentioned a nonfiction work that writers would appreciate. Could you type it into the chat so that everybody can see it? And while you're doing that, so I have two preliminary observations of my own. The first is, no short story, no novel is actually going to contain a world. If you think about the complexity of the world we live in, that cannot be contained by 100,000, 150,000, even 200,000 words. What we really need to do as writers is find the details that will suggest a world that the reader can then sort of fill in for themselves, all of the societal details that we can't possibly give them. And following on that, and following on something that JD said, I think too many writers, and I've seen this in very famous writers' work too, think that world building is something that's separate from story. And that's where you get I'm going to give you 5 pages of how my warp drive works, right? I'm just going to stop the story dead so that you can have all of this wonderful tech information, right? And I think that the best writers, the writers that I admire in the genre, actually take a different approach. Everything that you put in your story is world building, right? From the names of the characters, the names of the streets they walk on, what the streets are made of, everything is potential. Everything has to be thought of in what is the world that is going on? What is the world that I'm trying to portray here? And if you think of it that way, then you drop a detail here, you drop a detail there, and by the end of the story, by the end of the novel, a reader who is actually paying attention will put all those things together and say, this is how your world works. Right?
And if I could just add on to that.
Sure.
There's a thing in psychology called the phenomenal field. And it's just that we have little triage officers up in our heads that sort out all the stimuli that surround us constantly into what's significant and what's not significant. What's not significant goes into long-term memory. What is significant, we have in like our ROM, or RAM rather, random access memory. And what we put into our characters' heads should be RAM, not long-term memory. So what matters to them is what should be described, not what matters to us, nor should we try to divine what's going to matter to the reader, because readers are going to get out of a work of literature whatever matters to them regardless. So in order to make a character realistic, that character has to process their reality the same way as we process ours, which means I'm only going to notice what's important to me in any given situation, and not every single detail of every building, of every car on the street, and so on. I'm just going to notice what's important to me, and that's always been my rule of thumb for describing the world in which my characters find themselves.
And that's part of the pleasure of being a writer, and also part of the pleasure of being a reader is, of course, to get into the heads of people who are not like you, right? To think through these things. It's also important, just to follow on that point, it's also really important to avoid the 1950s scientist cliche, right? This is how this scientific experiment went, and this is how it works and stuff, because most of the time, most people are not going to be talking about the technology. If the technology is important to your world building, you're going to have to find a different way of expressing it to the reader, because most people, the example that people give is, we don't sit around talking about how wonderful our piston engines work. You turn the key, the car goes on. That's all most people know, and that's all most people will talk about. And presumably future technologies will become normalized in the same way. Okay. Question for the panelists. Give us an example or two of really good world building, and I'll go around the other way this time. So JD, you're on the spot first.
Okay, so do we want stuff I've done that I think is really good, or stuff other people have done? Because that's
I tell you what, give me one of each.
Okay. An interesting bit of presenting world building is in Avram Davidson's Masters of the Maze, which is one of the great, often overlooked works of some genre. I still haven't figured out what, from the 60s. But one of the things that just I find fascinating is at one point he gives us the history, sort of the background, not in a I'm gonna info dump way, of a completely unfamiliar alien race as it's being discussed by members of a different completely unfamiliar alien race, so that we're deliberately being thrown, what the heck? Because we're getting, Davidson is so good in this novel that at one point, the sire of the Chelpeks, who are an insect-like race, attempts to do that human thing of telling a joke and bombs in exactly the way that I would imagine the sire of an insect-like sentient race probably would bomb if they tried to be funny. We're really into the work. Also, China Mayville in the Boz Log novels. You're just like you're walking through a city, and he'll make a reference. Oh, yes, that's from the period of the Malarial Kingdom, blah, blah, blah. What the hell is that? Shut up. You'll find out in another novel. But it's the way that we might notice a detail on the street. In terms of my own sometimes obsessive dedication to these things, the novella that ends, Live Dude Aliens, is set in an alternate early 70s, except in 1953, at the height of the flying saucer craze, the aliens landed and made overt contact, and then they left. And the entire history of the world has changed. I deliberately set it, most of the story, local to me, without ever naming the city, but I worked out how many things would change between the 50s and the 70s when the aliens land. So it's all told from the ground up, but you gradually get reference to things that don't add up with our world. There's like, I mean, Werner von Braun got everything he wanted. The space program became the center of everything. The world started cooperating. Several progressive causes like civil rights were accelerated, but so now is the reaction against them by reactionary forces, because it's really hard to see human beings as different from us after you've looked at non-humanoid aliens wandering around. So this is now filtered down. I mean, astronauts are heroes. And you keep running across references that are different. You know, Hendrix is still alive. Things of that nature. I really wanted him to still be alive, to not have died as he did. And so you get these references that aren't quite our culture. And whether anyone thinks of that piece or not, I've had some good feedback. I think what works about it for me is the world isn't obtrusive, but it's there as you keep brushing up against stuff that isn't the early 70s that we know. It's this other early 70s that has been completely shaped by the fact that we are watching the sky in a mixture of awe and terror, because it's like, holy crap, space is inhabited, other planets are inhabited, and at least one race has come to see us. And we don't know who else is out there. And the most important thing in the universe for us is to get the space program as accelerated as possible, because it's obvious that the last alien race we met and have come back again, our science is a joke to them. It's a quaint artifact, and they are so much more advanced than we are, and that's a little scary situation for human beings, even when the aliens appear to be friendly.
Thinking about what you've just said, I think a common problem with new writers is that they really want to over-explain, and they don't trust their readers to get all the clever stuff that they're throwing into their stories. And it sounds like you're really on top of that. It's like, this is different than the real world, and it's there, and you can figure it out if you want to, but I'm not going to spoon feed you the fact that, you know, this is an alternate reality. Which I think is very cool. Dale, examples of good world building.
The last few years at Gen Con, here in Indianapolis, they've had a guy from one of the universities. He's a geologist, and he comes and talks about mountains or deserts or rivers or, you know, all that's kind of item, and which I really, really like, because to me, I mean, you can fantasize a fantasy forest or whatever, but if you understand a lot of this stuff, I mean, the world you build at least is a lot more plausible, or, you know, a lot more consistent maybe. And the fourth novel, which is be coming out probably next year, I use a lot of that information he had on mountains for the setting that's in the novel. And so I would encourage people to really learn about, you know, like if you want to write castles, learn about castles. You know, they're just not walls of stone. You know, if you're going to learn, if you're going to go into the future, maybe look at what people are postulating. Maybe that'll help. Maybe it won't. As far as world building in well-known books, when I was sitting here trying to think of it, Alice in Wonderland came to mind, because I mean, here is a crazy world. I mean, it has almost nothing to do with ours at all, really. But nobody, you know, jumps up and down and goes, wait, you can't do that. You can't do that, you know. Now, yeah, there is a suspension of disbelief, but it's consistent in itself. And the characters are interesting enough and consistent in their world that, you know, nobody questions it. You know, it's just what it is, and has fun with it. So If you can do that with your novel, whatever it is, then you've succeeded.
Okay, Arlene?
Okay, the most impressive kind of world building that I've seen is by Neil Gaiman in Neverwhere. He talks about the other side of London, that there's a London that we all are familiar with, and then there's shadow London that's almost like it's out of phase with, at least the people in it are out of phase with our modern London, and they tend not to be noticed, and they're not seen by us. And I mean, there are, but what he's done is he's described London in such a way that, first of all, the shadow concept is plausible. And people like me, who have only a dim memory of London, because I visited there once, and that was decades ago. But he evokes the tone of the city in tremendous, vivid detail. And it just perfectly frames the story that he's telling. That's, to me, that is just the perfection of world building. It's not, it frames the story. It lets you enjoy the story, and you can also see in your mind the settings that he is describing. The characters are entering and interacting with each other in. For my own, there's a novella in Imaginary Friends that takes place on a colony world called Manua. And a generation ship 100 years ago found this world. It's called Manua because the landmass on which they've settled looks like a hand. And they've divided it into sections. So the city is at the base of the thumb. The farming is all done in the valleys that are formed by the fingers, and in between the valleys are mountain ranges. And the mining and resources and fabrication is all done in the heel of the hand. And I came up with this concept because I wanted to show a colony that had a lot of ideals on how to create the perfect human society. And so they've based this colony on 4 pillars: trust, interdependence, and so on. But there are problems. The main character is a farm girl. She's 15 years old. She lives in one of the Finger Valleys with her family. And the society that in which they live is very well defined. It has its rules, it has its customs, and this is actually the ideal human society. The other 2 are flawed, but this one is perfect. And so this book got great reviews, so I know I've succeeded. But that's my example of my own world building that I'm really proud of.
Okay. The author I'm going to name is just somebody who I've just been very taken with over the last year. He's an Israeli-born author who I believe lives in London. His name is Lavi Tidhar. His most famous novel is A Man Lies Dreaming, but I'm actually going to suggest the world building in a novel called The Escapement. The Escapement is it's a modern day story about a man whose son is dying in hospital. And he hears that there's a cure and the cure takes him to another universe where it's populated by clown archetypes. And I'm, because I write primarily comedy, I'm fascinated by clown archetypes to begin with. But uh, the world just makes its own kind of weird sense, and very much, I was very much taken by that. In a similar vein, I have a couple of different worlds that I could bring up in my own work, but the one I'm going to focus on is the alien world in the trilogy that I've just finished, known as the Multiverse Refugees trilogy. It's about a dying universe where, in a conceptual space where travel between universes is possible. So the Transdimensional Authority, which is the organization that monitors traffic between universes, decides that it's going to try and get as many of the sentient beings out of the dying universe and send them to stable universes as they can before the universe collapses. Their world is basically a Looney Tunes world. The race itself is 4 foot tall blue people with exaggerated rounded features and no hair, who wear exquisite 3-piece suits. And in their world, everything is falling from the sky: anvils, safes, pianos, whales, like just everything. And they have little umbrellas that can deflect things if they hold them over their heads. And the thing about that is that we find out eventually that in this world, the singularity happened, and all matter at all levels has become malleable by the beings, the sentient beings there. So this is the world that they've created. And one of the things that I don't go into depth in the world too much, but is there if people want to figure it out, is that it was a baseline Earth like the Earth we have, but everybody was obsessed with online popularity at the time that the singularity hit. So everybody is trying to make everybody else laugh. And this is kind of the motivation for creating the Looney Tunes world that they live in. Okay, wow, the time is going really fast. Hey, Keycon Boardroom, any questions or comments anybody there would like to add before we continue?
Not seeing any.
Okay. I don't know if it's a fair question. Do you guys want to talk about negative examples of world building? Things that didn't work
Yes.
well? Anybody? Arlene, you want to try that?
Negative examples of world building. All of the stories that I wrote prior to
I can
no,
see.
yeah.
I think we can all give that answer. Yeah.
You know, the stories that I've read that I remember were all by really skilled authors that I think we would have to dig into the files of some of these magazines for rejected stories, or authors in their early years, things that never made it past the drawer or the wastebasket.
Yeah, as a sort of aside to this, I'll allow that when I was editing Amazing Stories magazine, the level of just writerly competence was extremely high. And, you know, there weren't, I guess they were taking panels like this to heart, because they really, the level of the writing was really great. Okay, that's a terrible question. Let me do it. Unless.
Well, let me give you a trope that I alluded to earlier, because it's not necessarily bad world building. It might depend on the genre. I talked about alternate history. I have a pet peeve, and I think the more realistic the story, the more this is bad world building. And the more that you're dealing with, say, comedy, the less it becomes an issue. And the idea that you make a major change to world history, like, and this happens all the time by very good writers, um, you know, 500 years in the past, but somehow all the same historical figures still exist. And I sort of think that doesn't make any sense. And I understand they're doing it to show, how the alternate history worked out and, who Abraham Lincoln would have been in this, alternate history. But I always chafe a bit against that when that happens. I remember reading, a very good satiric novel, and it is satiric, Kingsley Amos's alternate history, The Alteration, where I thought, okay, if all of human history, especially European history, went on a different path 500 years ago, why are some of the same pop culture figures in existence, albeit in a very different form, in the present day? And I sort of feel like, why would that happen? On the other hand, if you apply that to, say, Back to the Future, that's a comedy and it's very charming. So I will try not to get annoyed about the fact that there's no bloody way that Marty McFly's parents would have the same 3 children. They now met under different circumstances. Their personalities have changed. They might have 3 children, but they would conceive them at different times. And therefore Marty McFly still doesn't exist and the movie isn't fun anymore. So because of that, we hand wave and say, come on, get a life. That's just how it happened. But I always feel like if you're going to change history, a whole lot of stuff is now off the table. If the Nazis won World War II, I'm sorry, almost anyone born after 1945, probably half of those people easily were not born. The history went differently, and a whole lot. And I know that that's picking at something, and I think a lot of it is genre dependent. Alice in Wonderland, you mentioned, is allowed to be really crazy because of the nature of the world, versus, maybe a more strictly realistic story where you have to nail some things down. I also I know it's hugely popular, but I also I'm one of the reasons that I'll accept it, but I sort of have issues with paranormal romance. Because I always feel like if vampires were real, they wouldn't be hidden. We'd know about it. We would have factored it into the way the world functions. And honestly, I think that's a much more interesting story than the story where there are thousands and thousands of vampires, not like a few, like in Dracula, and somehow the world is unaware of them. And again, I know genre shapes things in ways that where this won't apply.
Well, not only the world is not aware of them, but when I was watching the, what was it? I'm blanking on names. I was watching a vampire story where the vampires populated a bar in Mexico, and a couple of Americans go there, and there were
After Dusk.
After Dusk, yeah. And I was like, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of vampires in this place. How do they not overrun their food source, right? If there are large numbers of vampires, they will quickly take over the ecosystem and kill all of the humans. And in fact, there was a movie, and again, I'm blanking because
Daywalker?
Sorry?
Is it Daywalker? Daywalkers?
I'm not.
And Helsing.
No.
Daybreakers. There you go.
Yeah, where the vampires are actually the majority now, and they are, they're basically breeding humans for food, because that's the only way they can get enough blood. Problems like that is a big world building problem, and it takes me out of those types of stories. Dale, did you have an example?
Yeah, I'd just like to make a comment, and I'm not going to mention any names or anything because I don't want to comment. So, but a few years ago, Gen Con actually handed out a free book by a brand new author. I know a lot of people write books and they want to, prove something, preach something, that's kind of their motivation, which I personally don't care for. But in this book, the main character had a different set of morals than society today, and some aspects. That's fine. They mentioned it like every 10 pages in the first 60 pages of the book. And I just stopped reading the book because I'm like, why are you telling us this again? You know, if you want something different, that's fine. But, you know, it's, if your sky is yellow instead of blue, you don't have to mention it every time the character goes outside, you know. Excuse me.
Fair enough. On my calculation, we have about 3 minutes left. We might go over a little, but I can't go over too much because people have to get to their next event. So, summation. Arlene, I'm going to put you on the spot by starting you off this time. Any last words about on the subject of world building?
Yeah, okay. I actually, there are several things I could say, but this one I think is important. Plausibility trumps reality. And in order to make it plausible and realistic, you really have to get inside the heads of the characters, because without them, you have no story. And really, that's, to me, that's the most important part of this.
I'm completely pedantic, so I will point out that the first person to actually mention that was Aristotle, who in the Poetics said that a plausible untruth is better than an implausible truth, right?
Yeah.
And this drives scientists in particular nuts when certain science fiction writers will play with our understanding of science just to make the story work better. And I think there's a balance there where you need to, or sometimes you need to, but I think that it's a balance that needs to be carefully weighed. JD, any final thoughts?
It's hard to explain, to work out a consistent world if you're dealing with aliens, but you have to always remember that if the alien doesn't look like us, their world probably doesn't look like ours. And I think we get too used to that because out of necessity, science fiction has to have familiar landmarks, things that we can relate to. And science fiction media, TV shows and movies, you know, to a certain degree, they're just going to have to go somewhere and film it. And that somewhere is likely going to be on Earth. It was very, I don't know if anyone caught the most recent episode of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, where they actually filmed on the pods at Ontario Place and added some CGI to create the alien, the ruins of a colony. They don't have a choice, right? I mean, they don't have the budget to every week completely CGI. But if you're writing, I think there's a little more thinking about, you don't have to work out the whole ecosystem, but thinking about how it's going to be different from us in ways that are fairly consistently different. If your aliens are six-limbed, there's a likelihood that there's a lot of six-limbed creatures on their world. Well,
but it also, I mean, six limbs changes the tools they make, the vehicles that they get around in. I mean, everything changes because of that. Okay, Dale, any last thoughts?
A while agreeing with everything everybody said, but I would also say, especially if you're doing speculative science fiction, have fun with it. I mean, have some weird quirks that at least we think of weird quirks that aliens have, or have a society where everybody literally lies to themselves about something, but acts like it's the truth, you know. Stupid example would be the world is flat. I mean, you know, we still believe in 2022 that the world is flat, you know, everybody does. Everybody knows it or something, you know. Things like that could make the story very interesting. But also, I mean, to get the author, you know, very enthusiastic about what he's writing, to generate that extra, make it, fun to write. It doesn't have to be stolid or stringent or something, have fun with it.
Yeah, I always recommend it to my students that if you're having fun with writing, that will transfer to the reader. The reader will have fun reading it. We are out of time. So I'd like to thank Arlene, JD, and Dale for coming. I'd like to thank Stephen for sort of hosting it. He kind of handed it off to me very quickly, but he was here to start, and that's the important thing. Thanks to everybody in the Keycon boardroom. And
Thank you.
thank you. I have
Thank
another
you.
panel at 7, and I have a reading tomorrow, and everybody's got books, so go buy everybody's books, and we'll see you later.
I just got Arlene's last one off Amazon, so it's on the way.